Well, hello there, everybody. It is nice to be here with y'all doing this live Q&A. So today I'm popping in to answer a few questions that came up when we did our live stream series on Anxious Attachment 101. And for those of you that don't know, we did a week-long free promo of 4 bonus videos that I'm adding to my online course, Anxious Attachment 101. And so we looked at 4 specific topics within that. We aired the content for free for a 5-day period, and now there's an opportunity to purchase the online course at a discounted rate. You can learn more about that in the caption of this video. And so today what I'm doing is I'm popping in today, tomorrow, and the next day to answer questions that popped up on those videos and more, so that we can start to generate some awareness around what goes into these difficult experiences we sometimes have in our love and attachment relationships. And if you don't know me, my name is Brianna McWilliam. I am an author, educator, and licensed and board-certified creative arts therapist. I've been in the field for about 13 years now, and I am just wild about love and attachment in adult relationships and helping individuals that struggle with insecure attachments go from feeling lost and fearful and confused to stepping into what I call a position of self-sovereignty in their relationships, so that they can start calling in those soul-shaking, passionate partnerships that they want. And ideally, without having to talk in circles around their feelings for hours or even years on end with no tangible result. So today, I have collected a few of the questions that have popped up inside my private Facebook group, which is called Attachment in Adult Relationships. And if that's something that you're interested in joining, you can just go to facebook.com/groups/Brianna McWilliam and join me there. But there were some questions that popped up, and I thought that I would address this first one today. And this one pertains to anger. And anger is something that has come up, I would say, pretty frequently in the past couple of weeks in talking with private clients, and also in the comments of the videos that I've been creating, particularly when we did our module on the inner critic last week. So I thought this would be a good one to bring to the table today. And so if you are joining me during the live call, if you want to just type your name and where you are coming from in the chat box there, I can give you a shout out. And also, if you have questions that you would like to ask during this hour, I will try to address them. So first, I want to share this question with you. I've been trying to recover from what I know to have been severe narcissistic abuse. And I understand that he was the problem, not me. But I can't get over this huge anger I still have towards him. Some of this anger might be anger towards myself for having allowed all that happened and not to have defined my boundaries earlier. But even knowing all this, sometimes I just want to go to his place and destroy everything. I want to punch him. I want to insult him. I want to make postcards about who he is and share it with everyone, the kind of monster that he is. Everyone thinks he's so great, but he really wears a mask and hides who he truly is. My question is, how can I forget all that happened and get rid of this anger and hate? I feel that I am turning this onto myself as if I'm the responsible one, like I'm almost abusing myself. I've unfortunately allowed these things to happen, but it's not fair to say that it was all my fault. Sometimes I feel like forgiving myself will simply mean that I'm saying it was okay what he did and I'm just excusing him. It just feels that I will only be happy when I see him suffer as much as I've suffered. Please help me. Sometimes I just want to cry, quit my job so I don't see him at work, and break everything else. This is a terrible feeling. Okay, so what I think might help here is understanding how anger is really functioning in this situation. And to explain this, I'm going to call this the 7 faces of anger. So this is some content that I'm actually going to be including in a book that I'm writing this summer, which I have not shared on YouTube before, but I think it's worthwhile bringing it up here. So I'm calling this the 7 faces of anger. So let's talk about the 7 faces of anger, and then I'm going to discuss how this may apply to this question and circumstance. So the first one is the anger addict. Now, someone who feels addicted to their anger, it's because they feel more powerful and in control when they experience an angry feeling as opposed to a helpless or an out of control feeling. And that usually lies beneath it. So when this type of person feels threatened, anger is their immediate go-to in every circumstance. And they're also not likely to acknowledge or apologize for it later. Now, closely related, but a bit different, would be the face of being explosively angry and then apologetic. So this is someone who struggles with controlling their emotions altogether, and then they feel intensely remorseful afterwards. So this is someone who is also subject to emotional flooding, and their presentation could look a lot like the anger addict, but they have other emotions that could also erupt when threatened. So like crumbling into tears, or perhaps they behave in a clingy manner otherwise. They might try to affect reparations later on, whereas the anger addict wouldn't do that, because affecting a reparation would be an admission of fault or of helplessness or of blame, and they wouldn't do that. Okay. Then the third one would be passive aggressive. And so this is someone who fears direct confrontation. So then they find indirect ways of getting their message across. So this is that person who begrudgingly says yes to something and then shows up an hour late to the appointment. Or maybe they sabotage a project that you've been working on together in a very subversive kind of way that deflects blame, and they couldn't easily be pinned for it, right? So the fourth one then is turning in on the self. And I think this is probably one that applies in this circumstance. So this is someone who fears anger for a variety of reasons. And for whatever reason, it was unsafe to express their own anger in childhood. So they learned to turn it in on the self so as to keep the peace and remain in close proximity to that attachment figure. And they would also do the same for the people around them who are angry. They take on their anger, take it in. Oh, it must be my fault. So if you can assume fault for it and turn it in on yourself, then you use yourself as a way to try to transform that anger or to try to contain that anger so it doesn't threaten the attachment relationship. Okay. And I'm going to go more deeply into that when I talk about how this relates to this question, because I imagine it applies to a lot of people. Then number 5 would be what I call the blame game. So this is a blame gamer, someone who can't accept blame for anything, because that would mean that they would have to take responsibility for themselves. And in order to do that, you have to first have a sense of self. And then secondly, if you have to take responsibility for yourself, that means you have to face your own fears of failure, inadequacy, or truly being unlovable or unworthy. And oftentimes we don't feel like we can confront that. So as a result, we criticize and blame other people for everything, even for our own failings. Okay, because the other side of that is just too scary. Then there is number 6 would be the angry connector. I said 7. I should have said 9. Then there's the angry connector. So for some, especially those that grew up in a really angry or physically aggressive household, fighting and confrontation may have been the only time during which you actually received emotional contact and attention. So you might be getting, hit in that moment, but at least you're being acknowledged. And at least in that moment, you know that you exist. Whereas in any other circumstance, you might be neglected, dismissed, or unacknowledged, and therefore invisible, and therefore you don't exist. So only in a state of conflict do you actually experience your own vitality and existence. Okay, so that means that you're going to seek out and or create conflictual situations subsequent because you want to exist. We all are compelled towards a state of survival. Okay. Now, similarly, you could also have an angry connector who comes from a more dismissive household. So there may not have been a lot of aggression or outward anger, but there might have been a lot of emotional dismissal, in which case the expression of anger could mean that, oh, they care enough to get angry about this. So similarly, that type of person could create conflictual scenarios to test their partner, to see if they can rile their partner up. Oh, then they must still care about me. There must be a modicum of that must mean that my attachment proximity is closer than I thought, or it's getting closer because I'm riling them up, and now they're forced to see how much they care about me. Okay. So number 7 would be the vengeful sadist. So depending on the nature of early childhood wounding, and we all have a measure of sadism within us, but if we have a powerful sadist within us, this is someone who doesn't just fantasize about slashing somebody's tires. This is someone who goes out and does it. Okay. Then if you have a powerful sadist, vengeful sadist within you, it's likely that you had early childhood wounding, likely preverbal. Okay, because that is a time in life when we start to tease out the difference between having the fantasy and being able to discharge some of the energy, tied anxiety and issues tied up in that fantasy. By having the fantasy, we can discharge it a little bit. By bitching to our friends, we can discharge it a little bit. By blocking someone on Facebook, we can discharge a little bit of it. But someone who isn't able to do that, who isn't able to experience any kind of discharge by means of sublimation, more or less, and they have to go out and slash that person's tires, it's because they haven't developed enough boundaries and internal vocabulary to negotiate that kind of emotional charge. So that's where we get into the vengeful, sort of sadist face of anger. And this is someone who becomes obsessed with recompense. Okay. And oh no, you don't hurt me and get away with it. I'm the one who hurts you. And they could even come across as acting like, oh, I'm over it. It doesn't bother me. Meanwhile, they're sort of plotting in the background your ultimate comeuppance, right? Then number 8 would be the cool head. And so this is someone who finds anger completely unacceptable on all levels across the board. And they remove themselves from any triggering situation whatsoever, physically or emotionally, or both. So a cool head would not allow themselves to express anger in any form, and they would find it repulsive in other people. And so a cool head is just that. They are cold and they are detached. But even in these circumstances, the anger inevitably causes some form of emotional leakage. It's got to come out somewhere. So it could manifest itself through anxiety. It could manifest itself through psychosomatic symptoms. It could manifest itself with relationship problems, because if you are restricting the full range of your emotions, including anger, then you're really incapable of being fully emotionally present, aren't you? And available. And so then you're going to struggle to find, feel, and truly experience not only being loved, but giving love and experiencing what true intimacy is with someone. So if you're always cutting off your anger, you're actually making it almost impossible to be vulnerable. And then the 9th one, which is I call steady on. So the 9th one is what we might associate with secure attachment. And that's someone who can express their anger using feeling statements as opposed to blaming or criticizing. And it's someone who is okay with anger, doesn't think that it is an emotion that is going to destroy attachment security or attachment proximity. Anger, just because you're mad, doesn't mean that you are of no value, or that you're going to be abandoned. It just means that you're mad. And we're going to have a conversation about this. And you don't need to disconnect your affect from when you talk. You can have an angry expression, but still be talking in such a way that allows for an open dialogue. And you also know how to repair. You might even just type this in the chat box there for those of you that are watching. I would love to know that for whatever arguments you witnessed or maybe didn't witness as a child, did you ever witness a repair? So when your parents argued, did you ever see them repair whatever that conflict was about? Now, I had an interesting situation personally. My mother remarried and had a very be loud to be heard kind of relationship. So she was with a partner where they just got louder and louder and louder and louder and louder and louder and louder, and never saw a repair. On the other hand, my father remarried someone who was conflict avoidant, and he was passive aggressive and conflict avoidant. So they would fight behind closed doors. The house would just get really silent when they were arguing, and also never saw a repair. Just eventually they would start talking to each other again. And so oftentimes we don't see repairs. We don't know how to repair that. So if we see something, whether it is cold withdrawal and disappearance and isolation, or fiery, angry, scary shows of aggression and anger, if we don't see any repair of either of those things, then both of those become dangerous and threatening. And then we come to understand anger as being an expression of two ends of a spectrum. We don't really understand the midpoint, right? And oftentimes parents will feel like, well, we're not going to expose our child to our arguing, or we're not going to expose our child to discord in the relationship. But then you have to imagine that, you grow up not modeling for your children how to manage discord in a relationship, especially if you're not talking to them openly about it. So these are, I said 7, but I should have said 9, 9 faces of what I'm going to call 9 faces of anger. And let's see, I want to talk about how this relates to the question that was asked, but I want to also just welcome people who've joined us here on the call. We have Gloria, welcome. Sandy, welcome. We have, let's see, Paula, welcome. No repair ever. They did not openly fight. On a few occasions, I saw my dad apologize to my mom. He was usually the one who called names or blew up. My parents tried to physically kill each other, so there was no repair. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry about that. That's very difficult. Okay, so it sounds like a sort of an explosive and apologetic, angry face there. So I want to bring this discussion back to the original question. Okay. And so I'll just go over it one more time. I've been trying to recover from narcissistic abuse. I understand the problem was not me, but I can't get over the anger I have towards them. Sometimes this anger could be anger towards myself because I feel like I might have allowed this to go on for so long because I didn't define my boundaries earlier. But even knowing all of that, sometimes I still want to go to his place, destroy everything, insult him, slander his name, that kind of thing. So how can I forget all that happened to get rid of the anger? Because I know that I'm turning this in on myself, and it feels like being this angry is actually hurting me more than it's hurting him. But on the other hand, I also feel like forgiving myself would be forgiving him and making it okay. So you might even take a guess in the chat box there what the layering is here. But I would take a stab that it's likely that there's turning in on the self going on, maybe a little bit of blame gaming, maybe a little bit of angry connector, and maybe a little bit of vengeful sadist. And all of these, I would say, are based on really early childhood wounding. Not necessarily that there was outward abuse per se, but what stands out to me the most is that there is a fuzzy and kind of diffuse sense of self, and there's a confusion around what's me and what's them. So if I forgive myself for this, then they get off, right? And so in that statement, there's a confusion about what is me and what is them. Right? So that points to a more diffuse sense of self, a sort of ill-defined sense of self. And if I punish myself, then somehow they will suffer, which logically we know that's not the case. You're just suffering and they're off doing whatever, and they may not even give a shit. Right? And if this person truly does qualify as having, let's say, narcissistic personality disorder, as opposed to just having narcissistic traits, then it's likely they don't give a shit. So at least insofar as if that's your experience and you're not, supplying them anymore, then they don't. So the only person that's really being harmed here is you. So a statement like this kind of points towards an enmeshed dynamic that's going on. So that means that, as I said before, there's little to no boundaries between you and whomever it is that you're involving yourself with. Okay. So if you forgive yourself, it's like you're forgiving him. So that means that you're confused about what's you and what's him. And I would argue that this may in fact be the gift of this relationship, which is that you're now in a position to recognize where your boundaries may be diffuse and fuzzy, and thus able now to step into a clearer sense of self-definition, right? And developing self-identity. And there may be some issues around blame, not just that you're blaming somebody else for your issues, but you're also blaming yourself for something that's not your issue, right? So there's a difference between taking responsibility for something, blaming somebody else for something, and taking responsibility for what you are responsible for, and not taking on responsibility for what you're not responsible for. And that all comes down to boundaries, because boundaries are what help you define, okay, so all of this up to here is really what I own. But all of that, yeah, that's what you own. That's what you own. And I'm not taking that on. I'm not taking that on. That's your stuff. Yours, right? So blame can actually be useful in this circumstance if you're someone who turns it in on the self, if you're someone who turns anger in on the self. Blame can be useful in that it allows you to get to the next better feeling, which is it's not all on me. right? And it seems like you're dancing around that. Like you're definitely in a process here. But so blame is useful in that sense. If you're someone who puts, but this is the catch with that. If you're someone who puts all the blame on somebody else, then what happens is inevitably it gets flipped back on yourself. And so then you will start taking on all the blame, because if all the blame is on them, then that leaves you completely helpless and out of control, right? And nobody likes that. So then we take all the blame on ourselves. Well, all the blame is on me, but at least that means I was in control at some point. But at least that means that I wasn't totally helpless at some point. And if we're confused about, if we don't know how to, kind of parcel it out a little bit, you're going to flip-flop between, oh no, it was all his fault. Oh no, it's all my fault. I should have known better, right? And it's not like just in this question alone, you've flip-flopped a couple times. So, that's the benefit of blame, and that's the downside of blame, right? Because then we'll turn it in on ourselves. We'll turn in on ourselves all that portion that doesn't actually belong to us. And then it becomes a really punitive inner critic, right? And this, again, is likely due to pre-verbal early or early childhood wounding. And so anger plays an interesting role in this, because while anger can be this kind of energetic state that can blanket helpless feelings, like in the instance of the anger addict, or explosive and remorseful face of anger, it can also be a really wonderful self-advocate, because it helps us define these boundaries and set limits. So, for example, after a relationship like this one, you might find yourself thinking, I want to find myself. I want to discover who I really am and what I want. I'm tired of being so concerned about everybody else's approval. I want to have a close relationship and still be my own person. I want to let go of this anger and I want to feel free, but I can't get past this need to see them suffer, right? That's the vengeful sadist. So, this is really where anger becomes that double-edged sword. So on the one hand, it helps preserve our integrity and our self-regard. And on the other hand, if we just let it completely take us over, then it kind of exacerbates the problem, right? Or, as we also discussed, it can serve to preserve the attachment relationship. So in other words, this question is being posed at a time in life where this person is in a position of being rid of someone who has a narcissistic construct, at least according to them. So wouldn't you want to be rid of that, right? Wouldn't you want to be rid of that? But they are preoccupied with it. They are torturing themselves with fantasies of continuing to engage with that person, punishing them. And you have to realize that having fantasies about punishing a person is a form of continuing to engage with it, right? So it is, in essence, it's a way of continuing to maintain the attachment relationship, even if it's in the mental and emotional psychic space. And that's where we see enmeshment going on. So this is something I think is important to point out. A lot of therapeutic approaches suggest that getting to know your anger in a safe place first is helpful. And I would agree with that. Finding a safe space and container in which to express your anger is really important. And, ideally in a therapeutic space. And then you would pay attention to your physiological response as an indication of anger. Where does it live in my body? And we've talked about this before on my channel, that before you can start to suss out your boundaries and feeling states, you got to use your body as a way to identify them. Well, when I feel angry, my blood starts to pound, my heart starts to race, I feel constriction in my throat, I feel like there's a lot of energy in my hands, I want to punch things, right? So noticing how it lives in your body. Then you sort of establish a window of tolerance for that. So what topics can you discuss allow for enough of that feeling to where you bring yourself just to the edge of feeling like I can handle this, right? And then you allow yourself to relax, whatever techniques you're using, breathing, visualization, art making, things like that, movement. So you kind of, over time, you bring yourself to the edge of that feeling and you let yourself relax. And you bring yourself to a farther edge of that feeling and you let yourself relax. And then you bring yourself out to even wider and then you let yourself relax. And over time, you're suddenly creating all of this space where you have begun to map what's going on, right? So now next time you get angry, in a circumstance, you can be like, okay, well, I don't have to go all the way out to here, but I can just hang out in here somewhere. And I know that's safe because I've already explored that boundary. I've already explored that periphery within myself, right? Within my window of tolerance. So that's kind of one way that, we work with it therapeutically. And then you step into cognitive reframing, which is to look at destructive versus constructive forms of anger. Because as we mentioned before, anger can be both constructive, right? It allows you, it's a form of self-advocacy. No, you're not going to do that anymore. And if you can allow yourself to be angry enough, then you start dancing around self-definition, right? Until you become flooded. And then you feel as though you lose yourself altogether. Then you're back into that amorphous and enmeshed state, right? So the other thing I want to talk about is oftentimes therapists will recommend using I statements or I messages or I am feeling XYZ, right? When you're in an angry state. And these, of course, are wonderful things to use. I refer to them as deep structure communications. But one thing I want to mention about that is it is kind of a higher level of functioning. Like in order to acquire that and in order to use that effectively in partnership, it requires a bit of a higher level of functioning. So meaning that you have to have a more, varied vocabulary for feeling states. And oftentimes people who struggle with attachment woundings, particularly if it's severe attachment wounding, they don't have that vocabulary. So suggesting that someone use I statements or feeling statements to express how they're feeling with a partner to try to affect some kind of repair is going to be counterproductive because they're not going to have the vocabulary. And then they're going to beat themselves up for not being able to do it right. And there's going to be a perpetuation of that issue. Okay. And which is why I feel like oftentimes in these, if you are in partnership and you're in a relationship that's topsy-turvy and you're struggling to communicate, and also it's likely you're with someone else who has the same disposition. And so if you try to show up with an emotionally honest conversation and using I feel statements, they're just going to receive it as you trying to make it all about you. Right? Or they're just going to perceive it as you trying to manipulate them, or they're just going to perceive it as you trying to implement or trying to establish your own sense of self. And then they are going to feel abandoned. Right. And so then they're going to affect whatever their protest behaviors are or deactivating strategies are to punish you into behaving the way you were before. So yes, I statements and feeling statements are important, but you have to realize that that's kind of like further down the road. And it sounds like this particular question comes from someone who hasn't quite established enough of a sense of self and emotional vocabulary to start there, because they're going to turn it in on themselves. So there's a different approach that you want to take. And that is first finding self-definition. That's first doing the inner work. That's first doing the things that I do on this channel, which is going in, visualizing, using metaphor, tapping into the body, starting to build an adequate sense of self before you start to look at how do I exist in relationship to the other. And so what's the biggest point I want to make here before I close out this question? This is the biggest point I want to make, is that trying to forgive someone. So if you're reading a lot of self-help and you're watching YouTube videos and you're hearing all of the peace, love, and happiness, in order to get over this relationship, you're going to have to forgive him and forgive yourself first. That isn't going to help you, because that's just going to parrot whatever the inner critic is saying, which is that your power is scary, your anger is scary, and you can't entertain it. You just have to bypass it and forgive everybody and let everything be okay. And that's not going to serve you here. That's not going to serve you in this situation here right now. It may serve you a year from now, when you've been doing all the work I was just talking about, when you've developed an internal vocabulary and language for your feeling states, when you're much clearer on what is you and what is somebody else, and when you're much clearer on, okay, this was my part, but this was his part, right? Do not try to forgive him or yourself before you do that, because it's just going to feed the turning in on the self mechanism, right? I have to be good. I have to be forgiving. I have to be all these things in order to be happy. I would say explore the anger first. And in fact, if you allow yourself to be angry first, you're going to get to that place faster, to the place of forgiveness faster, because the anger is going to give you more self-definition. Attempting to forgive someone for feeling invaded upon before you have really figured out who and what you are and what they have invaded upon is just going to be a reliving of a dismissal of that invasion. Okay. And if that's the case, then your sense of self will remain kind of funny and diffuse and an amorphous, abstract concept. And so in essence, you cannot skip until the end. You cannot skip to the end. You have to go through the process. Okay. So I would say that explore the anger, explore the sadistic side. When I feel angry, I go to a place called the Wrecking Club. In New York, it's in Chelsea, and you go and you smash as much as you want. You can just buy things a la carte, like old thrown out computers and plates and things like that. You take them into a cement room. They give you a bat and a crowbar, and basically you go to town. Like, do that. Do that. You really have to do that. Because that's what's going to allow you to disconnect. The anger you're feeling is trying to help you disconnect. But then there's a part of you that's like, no, we can't disconnect. So turn the anger in on the self so we remain connected. The anger is a charge. It's an energetic flow. It's trying to go like this, and it's trying to help you gain some self-definition. And even in what you are expressing, you're this close to it. But then there's a mechanism it's triggering, a defense mechanism it's triggering that's like, whoa, that anger and that power is super scary. And that's going to mean that we're not going to be connected to this attachment figure anymore. So you better turn it on yourself, because, well, I must have brought this on myself. So now this guy's the best I can deserve. So I have to torture myself with the ideas of torturing him for the rest of my life. Right. So that would probably be the biggest point I want to make. Don't try to escape your anger. Don't try to forgive something when you're not ready. If blame is useful to you, use that blame. Use that blame, get it out. Find safe ways to express how you're feeling. And if you allow for it, and if you find safe ways in which to do this, and I highly recommend working with a therapist on this, you will eventually that charge will move its way through you, and you will burn yourself out on it. But the benefit of having burned yourself out on it is that now you have a self that understands it's burned out. Now you have a self that's like, oh, that's how much was mine, and that's how much was his, right? And that may be the gift in this particular wound here. Okay. So we have some comments here. Not sure how I was able to be secure when my childhood had physical abuse towards myself and my mother. I jumped in so many times to save my mom while she was being physically abused by my father. Okay. I'm sorry to hear that. That's a good explanation. I blame myself for almost everything from when I was a child. I can use boundaries like that to clarify what's really mine. Yes, definitely. Safe anger. Love it. Yep. It's important to feel the anger. I agree. Otherwise, it would set people up to go in the same cycles again. I know that's why I repeated it. Sadly. Good point. Yeah. Self-definition definitely helps. Have to open a wrecking club in UK. Oh yeah. I mean, such a great idea. Healthy anger is great once you learn how to navigate through it instead of disconnecting it, look at it and nurture it. Exactly. Right. And I mean, the other thing to realize too is that anger is part of experiencing the full range of your emotions. Right. And so when I talk about, I said 7, but I should have said 9. The 9 faces of anger. Basically, it's looking at how anger is not just one thing. It functions in so many different ways, and thus anger is more like a way we experience charge, like the way we experience the charge in our bodies, and the way we experience the energy that is attributed to these life experiences that we have. And usually, it is. When you feel angry, it's helpful to think about how is the anger serving me in this circumstance. And even if it's an experience of being flooded over or overwhelmed by your anger, that in and of itself is an informative experience, isn't it? That in and of itself, the anger is telling you and pointing you towards something that you may want to look at and recognize. and work with and be in dialogue with, right? So that was kind of what I wanted to share about that. So I would love to see in the comments here below. Thank you for those that did comment so far. I'm at the end of my time here, but if you have more questions about anger or anything else related to anxious attachment and other related topics, you can post them in the comment feed here. I'm going to be coming back tomorrow at the same time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, to answer more questions. I will be back again on Friday, and that will wrap up our live stream series for this week. So we do have one question. How do you reconcile anger and hurt from someone who is deceased? Ooh, that's a good one. That's right up my alley too, because I write a lot about complicated grief. So I may address that question. I'll probably tackle that question first tomorrow, because I could come up with an equally long answer to that one. So thank you everybody for watching, and hopefully I will see you back here again tomorrow at the same time. And also, just as a reminder, this is in promotion of my course on Anxious Attachment 101, 5 days to take the open heart from clingy to confident. And if you're interested in learning more about that, that's 30% off until the end of this month. And I will put a link to that in the caption of this video. Thank you.